5,300 photos. That is how many photos I've taken with Sony A7R Mark V. I've done that in just around about 9 to 10 months. And it just goes to show either how good this camera really is, how much I've enjoyed using it, or simply how many photos I actually have to take to get just one good photo. I've used it for over 20 weddings, I've done engagement shoots, corporate events, and even used it for a large amount of filming right here on the YouTube channel. So after a year of what you could say being used and abused, do I really think it's worth the premium price tag that Sony's put on it? Or is it just a massive £4,000 worth of regret? Let's find out. Now, if you're watching this video, I suspect you know what all the features are of this camera, but if you don't, I have a bunch of videos up here which you can watch. Now, when it comes to the photography, I want to make a big statement right here. I want to say that this is by far the best camera I've owned and the best camera I've had the opportunity to use. One of the features that allows me to confidently say that is the autofocus. It still blows my mind how accurate and how good it is at locking onto the subject. Be able to track your subject across the whole screen, and 99.9% of the time, it's always on the money. Anytime that I've entirely misfocused with this camera, I will hold my hands up and say it's user error. It normally is with me. Obviously, the performance that you get from the camera comes hand in hand with the lens that you put on it. If you put a lens which is slow to focus, then unfortunately you're still gonna have a camera which is slower to focus. So obviously, if you're thinking about buying this camera, do bear that in mind. But after a year's worth of photos, this camera hasn't let me down that much. And when it's got down to the crucial moments, it's never let me down. As long as I have the camera set up in the right focus mode for the situation that I'm in, I can confidently press the button on the back of the camera, take the photos, and forget about it. I can concentrate on other elements of the photography. Now, I never thought I would become the photographer to say this, but having 61 megapixels is just, can I say epic? I feel like I'm too old to use that word these days. Having all that detail inside the camera gives me the opportunity to be able to recompose the shot inside Lightroom if I have to. Whether this is down to not having enough reach on the lens that I'm using at that moment in time, or if I want to turn a landscape image into a portrait image without losing too much detail. And on this camera, I do normally just shoot in compressed RAW rather than uncompressed RAW, mainly for the file size. There is a technical drawback when it comes to color depth. I've done a video about it up here. But honestly, in the real world, I've never found myself thinking, I really wish I'd have shot in uncompressed RAW. In that same video, I spoke about lossless medium and lossless small. And can I just hold my hands up right now and say I was wrong? Lossless small and medium allows you to shoot in a lower pixel density while still using the full width of the sensor. And I said, but then why would you go out and buy a Sony A7Rv to have 61 megapixels to not use 61 megapixels? And I was an idiot. Sometimes you just simply don't need 61 megapixels. I didn't until I actually used it. It was a pixel peeping part of my life, and I'm not proud of myself. If you're away with family using your camera, do you really need 61 megapixels? Probably not. And I know that some people say that they prefer shooting night sky images using a lower megapixel camera, such as on the A7S3 or the A7 IV, but obviously sometimes you want something with a little bit more detail. However, obviously we choose to use cameras all differently. Now, the screen on this thing is absolutely fantastic. I never thought that I would miss the typical old tilt screen like from the Sony A7 III, because when we moved to the A7S III, you had the flippy screen so you could see in front of you like I can now. However, with the new 4D screen that Sony's put on this, I guess you wouldn't miss it if you didn't already have it, but once you've got it, you never want to go back. Now, with this camera being part of the A7R series, you wouldn't expect it to be a nifty video camera, but you'd be wrong. And the video capability of this camera was a contributing factor as to why I bought it. I use this camera in full frame 4K in 25 frames per second. I also use it in 4K at 50 frames per second. However, there is a small crop when you're using that. I'm not going to lie, it is a drawback that you have to consider. However, it's not a massive limitation. The reason I say this is when you're shooting at 25 FPS, you have the option to use active stabilization. That gives you a 1.1 times crop. But this camera also has lens breathing compensation, and if you enable that, you get a further 10% crop. So if you enable both of them, by the time you see your finished field of view, you're pretty much at the same place as where you would be at 50 frames per second in S&Q mode. But whilst we're on the topic of video, I will address a couple of elephants in the room. First up, this camera has 8K, and unless you're going to be using it for a static tripod shot, I think it's useless. The rolling shutter for me makes it unusable. I've used it once in the past on a tripod, and it was really useful because I could reframe the shot in post to make it look like I had two separate different camera angles just from using one camera. But the extra money you have to pay to be able to get 8K, it doesn't really justify the quality that you get from it and how much I use it. Now in 4K, the rolling shutter is still there, and you would expect it to be because it's still got a large sensor and it doesn't have a global shutter. But honestly, I wouldn't say it's any worse than other camera brands out there on the market. But something we have to remind ourselves is that this is predominantly a photography camera, not a video camera. For me, I've really enjoyed using this camera. 53,000 photos. It actually made me feel sick when I saw that number. Do I think that it's worth the large price tag? Well, the answer is a little bit twofold. Yes, I do think it's worth it when comparing it to other Sonys in the market. Sony cameras are becoming more expensive as years go on. And I know that if I'd have bought the Sony A7 IV over the A7R5, I'd probably regret it. I'd have probably always thought that the Sony A7 IV isn't the right camera for me, whereas this does pretty much everything that I need it to. And for that, I can't put a value on its worth. I'm a working photographer, and this is just a tool. Over the last 9 to 10 months, this has definitely paid for itself many times over. However, saying that, I know full well that it's definitely not the right camera for everybody. Now, the flip side to that conclusion is that when you're comparing it to other camera brands out there on the market, which isn't Sony, it gets a little bit interesting. There's some other brands and other cameras out there which perform almost as good as this, maybe even a little bit better, for a fraction of the price. And for that, honestly, sometimes there is a little bit of regret there for me. And I ain't gonna lie, it's played on my mind a fair bit recently, but that's for another video. Now, if you wanna see how well this camera performs under pressure, then make sure you watch this video right here. Feel free to hit the like button if this video has helped you, hit the subscribe button to see more, and I'll see you real soon.